You're listening to the Write Right podcast with the Story Perfect Editing Services team. Visit us at www.storyperfectediting.com for more information on developmental editing, copy editing, and proofreading services for your novel. Season 1, Episode 1. Welcome to the Write Right podcast with the Story Perfect Editing Services team. I'm Elon.
I'm John Robin.
I'm Katie.
I'm Dale.
And I'm Lizette.
Yeah, and we're very excited. This is kind of a pilot episode. We're not even sure if we're going to publish it. We're just experimenting, and we're thrilled to be seeing each other. I need that edited. Could you help? One another in the digital flesh. So this month, I suppose, because we're doing a monthly podcast, this month we're going to talk about what hooks a reader. And this can be a variety of things. It can be tension that's introduced even past the first chapter. It can be something that really grips you in the prologue. It can be something that you just love about the first page, the first sentence. And I have not a lot of experience editing, and particularly in fiction. So I'm going to come at it from the perspective of a reader. But we have some fantastic editors on the team with us that can go into sort of techniques to talk about how you come to hook a reader structurally, be it in a prologue, be it on a first page, or be it in the first third of a book. So I want to start with a book that I just finished, published by Tachyon. It's called Slow Bullets by Alastair Reynolds. It was really fantastic, and the first page really spoke to me. Because it did such a fantastic job of setting up character, emotion, and world in a really short space. You know, this first page, I'm showing it to the team, but without the benefit of the video feed, you can't understand just how few words this is. And if you guys don't mind, I'm just kind of going to read it to you, because I think that it was really good. All right, so here we go.
No copyright infringement intended.
Oh, none whatsoever. This is all, it's parody, don't you know?
Free promotion.
Or news broadcasting review.
My mother had a fondness for poetry. When my sister died, but before the news of my own conscription, Mother showed me passages from a work by Grierson. It was a poem called Morning Flowers. This was an illegal act. Grierson was the official war poet for the Central Worlds. Her works were banned in the peripheral systems, considered propaganda. But Grierson had been famous before the war, and my mother had collected several of her anthologies. She was supposed to have handed these books in during one of the amnesties. My mother could not do that. One of them had been a gift from Vavarel, with an inscription in Vavarel's beautiful flowing hand. My sister had always had better handwriting than me. So that's the entirety of the first page of this book. And when I read it, I was like, wow, there's a lot here, and I really want to turn this page desperately and find out more, because we get this notion of a recalcitrant soldier. We get death in the family. We get additional family members who prefer art to the law. And we see that there is a galactic scale conflict. And all of that information is compressed into this very short, highly informative, and in my opinion, very excellently put together first page. And, you know, I compare this experience specifically to a lot of other books that I read, a lot of epic fantasies that I think don't necessarily work on getting a great first page, because when you got like 900, you can afford to make that first chapter really strong. But when you have a 150-page book, that first page is enormous. So, for instance, I'm comparing that with The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, where the first page is nothing to write home about. It's like, it was windy and he had a bow. That's the entirety of the first page. But the prologue, which is, like 50 pages, is extraordinary. And it's one of my favorite prologues I've ever read. It's this amazing sequence between, Luz Theron Telamon and... I forget, what is it? Ishamael? Who is it?
Ishamael,
yeah.
Ishamael, yeah.
The representative of the Dark One. And it's just like this explosive thing that is so out of control huge. And then Jordan kind of brings it back into like small town setting where he's like, well, it's windy and a boy is walking from his farm to his small town, which is like an all day thing. And I find that contrast between this approach in epic fantasy and this approach in sort of short form sci-fi to be really telling. Um, and those are just two examples of there's so many that I can think of on my bookshelf downstairs. But I wanted to sort of bring these two and contrast them, and then ask you guys what you think about the hook in the first page or the hook in the prologue.
So you mean that is a general, like not just these books, but in general, using
yeah.
that technique? Okay. Should we maybe just take turns going around?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
if you have a thought, just jump on in. This is totally free form, just a conversation.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I'll start by saying I hate prologues. Really, I don't know why. Maybe I haven't read books with really great prologues, but I feel like if it doesn't fit, if you can't explain it in the story, don't tell me. Like, I appreciate that there can be like an interesting contrast between the prologue and the first page, so that the first page then becomes sort of a surprise. But I feel like the prologue is just when they can't figure out how to put that information anywhere else.
I agree with Katie because, like, for myself, whenever I read books, I absolutely despise flashbacks because I feel like it's one of the laziest ways of storytelling, of getting across, past information for myself.
I remember I sat on a live action slush session. So this is a session at a writing conference where you have a bunch of editors that will listen to the opening page of people's manuscripts that they submit randomly, and the editors put their hands up when they decide they would stop reading, and then when 3 or more have put their hands up, they stop, and then they go through the line of editors to say why.
That's
so it's
so
very
harsh.
informative.
That's rough.
It's very informative for the writers. But one interesting example of that, they had a prologue, and as soon as the reader said the word prologue, half the hands went up. I think it's very common that editors hate prologues. I personally am not against prologues, but I think the prologue has to be called for. Like in the case of Wheel of Time, I think that prologue is awesome. I wouldn't be surprised if Robert Jordan wrote that after the fact. Like I don't think he wrote. I think sometimes like Katie, you're saying that it's sort of like you go and set the story up and then tell the story.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of, especially in fantasy, a lot of people approach it that way, where. I wrote a short story called One Who Waits, which might become the prologue to Blood Dawn. I don't know yet if that's going to happen, but I'm hesitant to make a prologue because I don't think it needs a prologue. So I think it's something a writer should always really weigh carefully. Is that where your story starts? Is there sort of a early event that is underneath the narrative that's going to kind of bleed through so that the reader, having read that prologue, feels like they're launched into action, and then maybe the rest of the story might happen a little later, but this sort of event needs to be at the heart of the story. Like in the case of the prologue to the Wheel of Time, that event is at the heart of the entire series.
Yeah.
It comes back, and we get echoes of it all throughout the rest of the narrative. So in that case, it's a brilliantly placed prologue.
It's the biggest foreshadowing in any series, right? It's like a 14-book callback. One of the things I think is interesting, I agree in a lot of ways that a prologue is only valuable if it has value, I guess. That's a really lame tautology. But, I'm thinking about the prologue for the Wheel of Time and comparing it to the prologue in George Martin's series. Which I find incredibly frustrating, right? Because he sets up this grand, world-scale conflict and then just never talks about it again for like 6 books or whatever we're at now. It certainly feels like a slog to get back to this wonderful idea of like a, global scale conflict between the forces of cold and the forces of hot. And so I guess there are some serious considerations, and I think a lot of people grew up reading books that had prologues because it might be kind of an old school approach now that we're talking about it this way.
That was
think a
actually
good-
my thought.
Oh, go
Yeah.
ahead, Lizette.
Oh, sorry. My thought was that like I feel like every book I read between the ages of 11 and 14 had a prologue.
Mhm.
So I kind of wonder if a lot of writers who depend on it just kind of think like that's the way they're supposed to do it. Like
It's
a lot of the
formulaic.
like a lot of the writing tics that we pick up really early,
Yeah.
and a lot of the bad habits we develop.
Yeah, I
come from
started
that
an
same
epic
thing.
fantasy project that I've let kind of fall to the side. And I pulled an absolute, like, I really like The Eye of the World. I'm going to write a really big prologue and then have nothing to do with it for a while. And everyone who read it, and I got about like 40,000 words in before I told myself that it was too big of a project and I needed to focus on something a little smaller. Everyone who read it was like, well, why? What is the purpose of this? Are you gonna talk about this, or are you not gonna talk about this? And so I understand where you're coming from, uh, with this notion of inspiration from older books, or just feeling kind of like you have to.
I think something that's in older books that I like, as opposed to like maybe even an alternative to a prologue, is a map,
Mhm.
right?
Totally.
Like books that have a map on the inside cover, I love, because then you can sort of get, and even like you can still illustrate conflicts on the map too,
Mhm.
without like all the wordiness that tends to accompany those sorts of explanations.
Mhm.
I
What do
like
you
that
think
better.
about like techniques, for instance, in Dune, or there are a lot of books that do this. I'm thinking like Sanderson's his big series, The Stormlight Archive, introducing chapters with quotes that kind of set the stage. And a lot of the time, they'll serve as a hook. So, like, the first chapter of The Stormlight Archive has like a crazy quote about someone being killed, and the entire prologue, which it has a very large and action-packed prologue with someone being killed. It's a different person being killed in the quote before the first chapter, but it seems, and I guess that moment in the prologue is vital for the Stormlight Archive as well. It's this sort of larger scale conflict piece that eventually becomes necessary information that I suppose he couldn't fit anywhere else in a flashback chapter, or hinted at in various moments of dialogue. So I guess the question, as editors, when a project hits your desk and it has a prologue, what is your first approach? What do you do?
I know for me, I'm not turned off by a prologue just because it's a prologue. But my big thing would be to read the entire story and look at the story as an entirety, and then look at that prologue and see, is that prologue necessary? If we cut the prologue and started in the first chapter, would the story be fine without it? That's sort of like, I guess you maybe call it the prologue test. Just try cutting it out. And I take that approach sometimes with sentences. Like, there might be something an author has said in a manuscript, and I'll challenge them to just cut the sentence. And if you cut it out and you feel like something's missing, well, then you had something important to say with it. But if you cut it out and nothing is missing from the story, then you don't need it. I think it depends on a writer's maturity as well. Some writers, their first book, they're in love with everything they've written. So to try to say no prologue can really get hackles up. But I mean, just in my experience as a writer, myself, I'm not attached. I'm happy to kill stuff, to just get rid of chapters, because you can always rewrite it. And so I think if you work with a writer who has been through the editing process and has that maturity to do that, I mean, it's as far as the prologue goes, if it suits the work, great. I mean, I have no problem including a prologue.
I think that's a good approach, John, like to compare, see if you can just cut it. I might try that, but what I usually do is compare like the first sentence of the prologue with the first sentence of the first chapter. If they have an amazing first sentence of their first chapter, like you were saying, Elon, and their prologue is decreasing the effectiveness of that first chapter, then like I don't want it there ruining the reader's beginning. Like if the beginning should be that first chapter that's beautifully set up, and the prologue is ruining that somehow, I'll mix it.
When you're wearing your editor hat, is there something about the term prologue that makes you a little more cautious in that direction? Say chapter 2 has a fantastic opening and it really feels like the start of the book. Would you take that same approach, or would you how would you deal with that issue compared to prologue versus chapter 1?
Well, and maybe Lizette can weigh in on this, since she does a lot of the developmental editing. But like I think that's a developmental issue. You can say, this second chapter should really be the first chapter, and maybe they can rearrange it.
Yeah. I agree with that. Oh, should I elaborate?
Expand?
You don't have to if you feel like it's all been said. It's
No,
a
I mean,
conundrum.
I do agree that if you are going through it and you do see that other things start things off better, definitely suggest it. But I'm not exactly turned off when I see the word prologue, which now makes me feel if I'm some kind of an anomaly, because it doesn't bother me at all.
Yeah, I'm not even
But,
bothered by it.
One
I
thing
kind Oh, sorry.
go on. I'll hold the thought.
Oh man, I just lost my train of thought. Okay,
Headed
well,
derailment.
I think I kind of have the patience of a saint when it comes to reading stuff. I'll pretty much sit and take whatever is thrown at me. And I won't realize until the end of the book that I'm pissed about having to read garbage. So it's usually kind of I'll sort of weigh the prologue against the entire rest of the book.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like if asked to stop reading when I find something not interesting, I think I would fail that test with flying colors. 'Cause I'm pretty much going to be like, well, let's see where this goes. And if it goes straight to hell, oops, heck, then I'll really only kind of make that decision once I've completed the whole thing. So sometimes I guess a prologue can seem completely out of place, but I won't really make that decision until I've read the whole book, if that makes any sense.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's a lot like what John was saying earlier, which you named the prologue test, which I like very much, which is read the whole book. Not an easy test to perform on any manuscript. What about, it's probably genre specific, right? If you're writing a mystery, if you're writing an epic fantasy, if you're writing science fiction, if you're writing short fiction, it needs to be the first sentence in the first paragraph. What do you think about, phrasing this question is kind of, it's falling apart as I'm asking it. But how do you, what sort of allowances do you make based on genre when you don't find the hook early enough?
So for me, I did read a book like this, and I loved it. It was Ready Player One, which is amazing.
I loved it.
But early on, that is a lot of history to drudge through. It's the whole history of events that you haven't experienced, and it was dry for me until chapter 4. But I think that it's important as a reader and as an editor, a chapter, even sometimes 5 chapters, is not enough. You really, it's the same test. You have to read the whole book. Pretty much no matter what sometimes. If you get halfway through and it's still going nowhere, I might maybe scan ahead. But
Yeah.
But wouldn't a reader, a typical reader from, I don't know, Starbucks, just instantly just put the book down in that case? If it's that dry?
Some of them, maybe. I guess it depends on the reader, right? I'm a really avid reader. And I was really determined to like Ready Player One, which is why I didn't give up. So you're
That's
right.
a huge part of it, yeah.
Yeah, I had decided I was going to like this book, and I made it happen. So
yeah, that's a really good point.
I think some people are going to give up. A lot of readers do, but I think it also depends. If you've gone out of your way to buy this book, you're probably going to read it anyway, right?
Yeah.
If you've already bought it.
Yeah, I kind of think
Yeah.
that we make that decision when we're looking at the back of the book, whether we're going to like it or not.
Yeah.
If I read a back of the book and it's just white boys whining, I'm going to go into that knowing I'm going to hate
I wish that was a genre at Barnes and Noble.
That would make such a fantastic shelf to ignore. I think that's a really interesting point that we can actually, I think that's a fantastic topic for another podcast. How to write your log line, what to put together for the back of a book, how to really elegantly pull a reader in without giving away too much in, 4 sentences. Essentially pitching your book differently because you have to pitch it differently to an agent or to a publisher or to readers. And if you're going the indie publishing route or Inkshares or any of these other incredible options available to you now, that approach will necessarily differ for every attempt you make.
Has anyone here ever failed? Has everyone here ever opened a book that you bought and not finished it? You were like, I hate it. I'm not gonna make it.
Not that I bought, but books that I've been given, definitely. I was given H.W. What's his name? Somerset's Of Human Bondage. Have you heard of this book? It's an old book. It's not fantasy or sci-fi. It's an old book. Someone gave it to me in the wake of a very terrible breakup. Probably a big part of why I didn't read it. Instead, I read all of the Twilight series. So if you don't want to be my friend anymore, that is okay.
Solidarity, Elon.
Well, this sexy vampire thing is hard to stop. So
it's funny you mentioned Twilight.
Listeners, if you want to know what to do, sexy vampires and werewolves will do you just fine. But yeah, I just couldn't get into it. And I mean, it was written in presumably like the 1700s, so there were different techniques at play. There were different types of readers reading. But even I've read old books and liked them, and this just was so dry and sad, and there was nothing endearing about it. And there was nothing that said to me as a reader, hey, this is going to go somewhere. It was all like, everything's terrible, and it will be for the duration of this book. And sometimes that's what you want, but I don't think that there are a lot of readers anymore that want that experience. People want, they want to be hooked, they want to feel involved, and they want to feel invested at a fairly early stage. And I think that if you hadn't committed to liking Ready Player One, you might have given up by chapter 4.
I might have if I hadn't bought it.
Yeah, I find as a reader, I mean, my habit as a reader has always been to force myself through books. Mm-hmm. And I'm actually learning now to stop reading a book if I don't enjoy it. Yeah. And that's okay. There are so many books out there, and I think it's more of a shame to be forcing your way through books that don't say something to you than to you could give something a chance, but if it doesn't hook you, it doesn't mean it's a bad book. It just means that doesn't have something for you right then. I mean, I remember I tried reading Game of Thrones back in the late 90s when I picked the book up, and that prologue killed it. I started reading the first couple pages and nothing happened. But then, of course, the TV show came out and everyone's raving about Game of Thrones. So I picked it up again like 10 years later. And wow, did those books ever have a lot to say to me. And I can say the same thing about The Wheel of Time. I tried reading it as a teenager, and I think I made it all the way up to book 6. Yeah, I didn't get through book 6, but I finally just stopped. I just wasn't ready for it. And then I picked it up in my mid-20s. And at that point, it was just like that was the moment I was meant to read those books. So I think that in terms of getting through a book, I mean, it could be that it's not for you or it's not for you at the time. But unfortunately, there's also this issue of books can sometimes be poorly edited, and by that I mean we're in this age of the indie market. The indie market is huge. There's a lot of people who are publishing themselves, and so it's so important to have good editorial. So you're not everyone is going to necessarily like you put a book out and everyone's going to like it, right? There's that factor, but also even if you do give it to your audience and you don't tell the story true, you've got all kinds of excessive stuff. one of the points I was gonna was gonna bring up when Lizette was speaking earlier was about this idea of where do you start the story, and if the story starts in chapter 3, then that story starts in chapter 3, and then you're going to have to look at the author rewriting the beginning and restructuring it. So in terms of how we do editing, the first step is always that read through. And I sort of designed things that way with this company because in modeling what they do in the traditional industry, you have an editor. The first step, they don't even make any markings on the manuscript. You read it as if you're reading a book, and you think about it from that angle. Like, where is it falling off the tracks? Where does this need to be rewritten, tightened? Where do we need new scenes? And it could even go to the end. Does the end fall apart? Does it not resolve? Are you setting things up? It's like you introduce a gun in Act 1 and you don't use it in Act 3. Like all these sorts of things. So you read it through and you think structurally, and then you go and with that you develop it. So I think if a book has been given this treatment and you connect it to the right audience, that's great. I mean, unfortunately though, if you're reading an indie published book that hasn't been subjected to the right treatment, there might be a lot of fluff that will turn even the right audience away. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to that point, from an editorial perspective, when I read a book and I start it, if I'm editing it and not just reading it for fun, I do try to imagine who it's for. I try to imagine that I am that audience. Am I a twihard? How hard am I twying? Like, what exactly is it speaking to the twihard in me? And I think it's important to sort of be able to put yourself in those shoes and say, like, man, the fangirl in me is really loving this beginning, but the editor says maybe not. Like, it's a hard balance, but you have to sort of put yourself in the shoes of who it's intended for.
Yeah.
Yeah, have you ever, has your opinion as a reader ever compromised your editing? Is that a hat that is easy to put on and take off?
I don't think it ever had. Like, for me, it's not really a problem. Like, sometimes I like something, but I like things better the more like well edited they are. So there's really no contrast there for me. When I'm enjoying something as a reader, it works for me. And if I'm not enjoying it as a reader, then if it's not meant for me, it's easy for me to just come at it from a technical perspective and say, what just logistically needs to be changed here.
I mean, that seems like the responsible thing to do. After all, it's your profession, right? You should be able to separate yourself professionally from the thing that you like to do. Because I can't imagine that someone who doesn't have that particular skill set of separating their reader self and their editing self enjoys reading anymore. Because letting go of the technical aspect and just saying, okay, I'm going to read this book, we're going to see what happens. But I wanted to actually call back to something that John was talking about with the prevalence of independent publication options and the assumption that books don't need to be edited, or that if you've gone through it privately 3, 4, 5, 10 times, that it's really well edited and ready to go. And I think that's a mistaken notion, not that people are necessarily bad at editing their own work, but it is vital and critical to have someone else, preferably a professional set of eyes, take a look, because this is a thing they're trained in. They are trained in helping improve the quality of a story told, from high level developmental stuff down to the very basic grammatical stuff. And it's cool when there's a service out there that will provide editing services for you. There are a number that do this, but there is, I think, like an enormous avalanche of books out there that aren't being edited. And obviously we're here to change that. But I mean, we've been talking for about 20 minutes now. I don't know how long you guys want the podcast to be. I'm thinking 20 to 30 minutes is a pretty good amount of time. I really like the idea for the next topic about pitching or about distilling a book into something that is presentable to a variety of audiences, but we can talk about more things offline later. I do want to see if we can do like a tag that wraps the show, like final thoughts on the topic of hooks. And I don't want to start because you guys are super articulate and intelligent. So let's come up with a great question that we can ask and answer as a group with, a short monologue each about finding the hook in your story, whether or not to go with a prologue, or if it's okay to wait until chapter 3 to deliver that punchline that sinks the reader in for the rest of the story.
Okay.
And whoever wants to start, feel free.
So, and you want us to answer that question whether it's okay or not. In my opinion, the story needs to start on page 1, paragraph 1. Now that said, a story needs setup as well. I mean, the start of a story is the opening sequence. We need to meet a character. We need to connect with somebody who is clearly, there's some kind of conflict. There's some inner tension. We have to get a sense something is wrong. Or if something is right, something's going to go wrong. It's sort of either or. And if you have an opening page that's just a big description of a hill or a forest, and then finally by the end of the page you meet a man walking on a path, and then the second page you might find out his name. If that's going on, that's most. I mean, some readers will wade through that, but I think that's a huge risk to take as a writer. You should ideally within the first paragraph, like. The very first example that you read, what was that book called again?
Slow Bullets by Alistair Reynolds.
First paragraph, you had information that immediately connected me to the protagonist or the main character there, and there was a sense that there's some inner conflict. And of course, for me personally, I heard about choosing art over. Art was illegal, or so there was something like that, which that got me interested, because that's just like I'm doing that in my own book. But I mean, even if I didn't have that interest, I think a lot of people relate to the idea of what would it be like if you were not allowed to practice your art. That's a very universal concept. So, but I mean, just things like that. I mean, there's immediate hook. And even if you have a prologue, you can do that in a prologue. If you write a prologue and the prologue doesn't do that, then the prologue should go, not because it's a prologue, but because you need to be writing where the story starts.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that would be my thing on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, like, I want to be involved from the first word. And for me personally, I really like character-driven books. And the more clever they are, and the more sort of not hero they are, the better for me. I want, like, conflict right away. And if that comes through the character or the setting, like, I don't really want to, like, sit in the classroom with them and watch the clock. I want to, like, jump in and start fighting something. Just in whatever way that manifests itself in the book, whatever action they have to give, I want it, like, pretty quickly. And I want the character to, like, their protagonist to be the main introduction for me.
Yeah, I agree with that. Starting with character, I think, is way better than starting with, like, setting or I'm not really sure of another example.
Well, I think that's, they call it world building disease, right? Where you spend all this effort, all this time building this fantastic, massive world and populating it with one-dimensional characters. Your Conan the Barbarian times 500 with one female character whose best attribute is that she listens. Which is like garbage, and stop doing that, world. There are just better stories to tell, and those have all been told over and over again. I like this notion of character within milieu, because people love so much to tell a visual story, but that's not a story. That's describing a bunch of things. And so what you do get from these hooks that we've just kind of touched on is this idea that it's not so much the event, but a character's response to the event that we find really enticing. And so you can have something that's a pretty basic event take place. The bell could ring, but what happens when that bell rings is where the hook lies. And
Well, I would even in addition to starting with character, I think starting with feeling is also a really good place to start. Like, if there is going to be a bell ring, is the character excited? Are they fearful? Are they nauseous? Whatever. Like,
Yeah.
it's always really good to start with a feeling, because then readers can tap into that, right away,
Well,
even
I
if
think
it's something they
feelings-
can't relate to.
Feelings make you ask questions, like why are they so happy? Why are they nervous? And if you're asking questions, that's what you want from your reader on the first page.
Right.
You want them asking questions about what's happening.
because that's why they turn to the next page. They're like, well,
Right.
maybe
For
they answer
instance.
that. It's like
Yeah.
just on the other side of this flap.
Never. It's never on the other side.
No, it's like several flaps later, at a minimum. But yeah, so I guess that's wonderful advice, I suppose, to me as a writer who's trying desperately to do the writing thing, and as an aspiring editor who wants to learn techniques to identify issues that I can't articulate very well as a reader, and then learn how to repair them as an editor. So I think with that, unless Dale, do you have anything to add?
Oh yeah, definitely. I gotta say, everyone has made really awesome points, and I agree with a lot of them. And for myself, as Lizette was speaking about a character being the hook into a story, as I see it, the first character that you introduce the reader to, that is essentially going to be the main vehicle, the main seats that they are going to strap themselves into and determine whether they are going to keep going or not throughout the story. Because a story is like a roller coaster of emotions and stuff. Like, you have your high points, you have your low points, and if you can't get hooked into that seat, aka the main character, you can't connect to them, if you can't invest yourself into them, then they're not just readers aren't going to bother with it at all.
Mm-hmm.
So
Definitely.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I would I want to add to sort of what Dale said there about definitely that first character you get introduced to, you're sort of, it's just like the reader meets them and is going to feel like, well, this person must be important because I'm meeting them right away. If you're dealing with a book that introduces multiple characters, every time you introduce a new character, it's almost like the story begins again. There has to be an opening hook. And I would carry this even further to say that every single chapter has to be treated like the beginning of a story. Because every time somebody puts your book down and picks it up to read it again, you're asking them to reinvest in the story. So the techniques you're using, you look at the story as a whole, and you need your hook for the story, but then you have all these little wheels. Each chapter is like its own little mini story.
Yeah.
George R.R. Martin does this brilliantly in his chapters. Every one of them feels like a set of short stories that are interlinked that tell a big story. And that's I really have taken a lot away from him when I think about story structure and how you really can connect to character, what characters are feeling, and the tension, and it's got to be a focus, and like something is going to happen that's going to move the character forward on their journey. And even if you have multiple characters and you visit different ones around, you still have all these different arrows that are flying forward, and they all have to continue to do that. So yeah.
That's a really good point, John, because I've read books that have good hooks in the beginning and then they fizzle.
Yeah.
And then you're sort of like more disappointed in the end than you would have been if the beginning weren't so good.
That's right. Yeah.
That's the ultimate betrayal, I think.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's one thing to like start boring and stay boring, but to start out awesome and then get boring, that hurts.
Yeah.
If you start with a murder and then the rest of your book is just like lawyers
Talking
going to
about
work.
just faffing about.
And this is why we do that structural edit first, that read through, because the beginning might suck and then the rest of the novel's fine, but the reverse can happen. The beginning can be awesome and then 70 pages of the rest of the manuscript completely fall apart, and then sort of we come at it a little bit like story doctors. I mean, I think the term book doctor, it was popularized a little bit before the ebook market took off, as it used to be if you were trying to submit your book to an agent for publication and you couldn't get it published, you hired what they called a book doctor, who would read it and give you feedback on how to write it and make it better. But I mean, that's not, I don't really like to use that term because in a sense when people come to us, they are ready to publish and they want to go through the process. So of course it always begins in the traditional publishing houses. They do the exact same thing. They have a first editor who reads it, gives an editorial letter, and then the author does radical rewrites if needed, and then the inline revisions begin. So I mean, you have to sort of see the whole roadmap, and so you know the middle could sag. That's another issue. You could have perfect beginning, perfect end, but the middle, you're not going to get to the end once you hit the middle, and that's another very common issue that comes up in manuscripts that require editing. So
Yeah, I had a thought earlier when I heard you say something again about the traditional publishing business, and I wanted to add this comment about the fact that a lot of the decisions that were made in terms of generating that process over, probably hundreds of iterations of trying to figure out how to publish books before the advent of the web, those considerations were made very deliberately. Why, why step A through, triple A prime, because there's so many steps to publishing traditionally, with edits, with re-edits, with agency, with publisher, with design considerations, and all those things are condensed into like 6 people now. And inevitably things get sort of lost in the shuffle because publishing a book of any kind is a huge undertaking, even if you're doing it on your own. Honestly, especially if you're doing it on your own. And so to model an editing group after this traditional idea, I think, is going to be really effective for independent authors because those decisions were made intentionally for those editing techniques for the process. So I think that a lot of people can benefit from that approach. So that's just my 2 cents about editing.
Yeah, it is very common
about it so far.
Well, you do see very commonly freelance editors, or I guess freelance editors would be the right term because the common approach is just to edit a story, and you might revise it a couple times, and then it either goes to publication or it goes somewhere else. I mean, that's commonly how it's done. And about almost 2 years ago, when I decided I wanted to do this differently, I did a lot of research into how editing models work, and I really thought, hey, it'd be great if authors who want to publish themselves can put something out that has gone through the same editorial ropes as what they would get traditionally. I mean, the one thing that they're not going to get with us is like people who've been working with Tor Books for 25 years and have worked on 800 novels or something.
Not yet.
Not yet, but we're getting there.
Talk to me in 25 years.
That's right. So that's the thing. We have to start somewhere. So why not start with the model? And the model can build on this tried and tested thing that's evolved from the industry. And it works. Those books and shelves, the stellar quality you see when you pick up a book that you bought from Chapters or Barnes & Noble, wherever you might buy your books. I mean, that is the fruit of this process. And like you're mentioning, Elon, it's sort of it's evolved over time, and it came to be that way for a reason. Trial and error. I'm sure they must have tried different things in the earlier days, but definitely the idea of having 3 people on board to move down the stages from the most abstract to the most concrete. That's quite important. Whereas just one editor who takes it all on themselves, unless the issues are very light and the genre is one where turnaround is quick, I definitely advise this broken up approach. So sometimes romance genres where the word counts are 40 to 50,000, and the authors are trying to put out a book a month. We might relax some of these like 3-person maneuvers, but we still approach from the same level. That's sort of the cascade editing style that we've been using for some of our clients. But it's just a way of condensing it when the issues are fewer and turnaround is quicker. But you still use the model. It's very very important.
Awesome. I think that was a perfect closing statement.
Okay.
How do you all feel?
Agreed. That was good.
Fabulous.